All right, designing for flexibility. So when designing with flexibility in mind, fuel gauges really are the ideal solution. Most or all of the protective thresholds are programmable, and they can be adjusted after the hardware design is complete through configuration updates. These config files are loaded on to the assembled PCBs during production rather than board assembly, so they don't necessarily need to be finalized before the hardware prototyping begins. The same IC can also be used for multiple chemistries, allowing you to build off a proven platform. So you make cell changes within your battery pack without needing to change the BMS hardware. And those changes can be as small as a similar cell with slightly more capacity or higher nominal voltage, or as large as an entirely different chemistry. In addition to choosing a fuel gauge, we generally advise designers oversize their FETs slightly for the projected current draw. There are a couple of benefits to doing this, such as reduced on-state resistance and the flexibility to increase the current limits as the device design cycle progresses. It's often quite difficult to estimate your device current requirements early in the cycle. So leaving some margin for flexibility reduces the cost of needing to make a design change on the BMS and revalidate the entire design if you need to exceed your initial power budget for some reason. And finally, if it's possible, within the PCB space constraints, we generally recommend designing in secondary over voltage protection, even if you don't know that you need it. This can be a fairly worthwhile de-risking strategy if you're unsure of the regulatory requirements. It's possible to implement it in such a way that it just becomes a PCB population option, and if you don't need it, you leave it out without changing the BOM cost much. And long-term manufacturability is one factor that is often at the front of our minds during a BMS design cycle. It's best to begin this process from the angle of the device. So figuring out life cycle expectations, and there's generally two questions to ask early in the design cycle. Those are, how long is the device intended to be sold into the market, and how long will replacement batteries need to be available to support the product after it's no longer sold? In our experience, that can be quite a few years after the end of life of the product. So making sure the battery is able to be manufactured for that entire duration is very important. Once you've established that, component selection on the BMS is fairly critical. The battery partner should really work closely with their component vendors to get life cycle estimates and commitments for long-term availability, especially for those key components in the BOM. In addition to making those decisions based on availability, it's best to try and specify alternates for all of your critical components if it's possible. Those critical components are often things like FETs, thermistors, fuses, PTCs, and control ICs. On the control IC side, it can be particularly difficult to specify an alternate, especially in the case of fuel gauges, since they're quite specific, but it is worth attempting early on before just ignoring it. And when it comes to specifying alternative components, you also must consider the regulatory implications. Many of these safety components are listed on UL and IEC reports, and the products are audited on regular intervals. So if the parts used in production don't match those on the test report, you're going to run into problems. You can mitigate some of this by testing alternatives up front, which lets you accelerate a switch between components if they're unavailable or something unexpectedly goes end of life. That said, testing these alternates up front can add a fair bit to the certification cost, so this must also be considered. Once you understand those cost implications, you can kind of put that all into the hat and make a risk-based decision on which approach to take. Another option, if it's less risky, is to specify those alternates during the design cycle, but not put them through regulatory certification until they're needed. So this kind of saves you some of the upfront costs at the expense of response time if you need to switch a component. So if you do need to switch a component, the regulatory approval time for those components varies based entirely on how they function within the BMS. If they're not safety critical, they generally don't require retesting, just a documentation and review process, which is typically somewhere around 4 weeks for UL 2054 or IEC 62133. The safety components are where you start to require retesting. So those are the FETs, the thermistors, the control ICs we talked about before. There's a little wiggle room if they're considered to be within the same family, but generally you're going to require some retesting. The evaluation of these usually limited to the functional category. So if it's a electronic part, you're going to have to redo the electronic testing and maybe some of the temperature testing, that type of thing. Recently, one control IC that has been considered to be in the same family is that BQ40Z50R2 I mentioned previously. There's an R1 part which can be reprogrammed to the R2 in production. And if it's on the initial test report, you can just switch between them without needing to do anything. That wraps up our introduction to designing battery management systems that are best suited to the needs of your medical device. I'm going to hand it back to Michelle for an introduction to Excell Battery, and we'll do the Q&A session. Thank you.